This is a story about the wave of the Australians and their influx into the early days of boxing. And a lot of this revolves around Joe Choynski, is how you pronounce it. Choynski. And his birth year is 1868. Now, I read an article that I came across in an Australian newspaper, and they were talking about Joe Choynski's first trip into Australia, and legend has it he was at a local watering hole, and he was worried about the snakes in the local area, and he showed the locals and the bartender his knife that he brought for protection. And the local Australians reportedly laughed at his knife and said, "That's not a knife, this is a knife." And they produced a machete that they used to fend off the black mambas in the area of Australia. And after that, Joe Choynski was much more prepared for the local scenery in Australia, as it was a very dangerous place. Now, later I'm going to read you the complete article that Joe Choynski published. I think it is in the year 1927, where he's talking about the wave of Australians in the days of the finish fights. And by finish fights, they just mean fights that have no round end. So they just went to whenever one man was basically on the verge of death. That's usually when they were about to stop it. These beginning era of pioneer boxing was very brutalistic. That's why it was outlawed in many areas, because the women were just appalled by it, and they would be bleeding and broken, and sometimes the crowd would even force them to continue in just such horrible conditions. So these are the beginning era of boxing in the days of the finish fight. And so the era immediately in front of Joe Choynski and his time in history is completely loaded with Australians. Perhaps it was the most rich era and the most Australians ever in history, as an invasion of talent hit the shores of America. Each reigned their own blend of trouble for the American fighters. And this is the story of the wave of the Australians. Now, as I said earlier, Joe Choynski's birth year is 1868. And we're going to go through the list here of all of these pioneer fighters here. We're going to show a little quick slideshow of these guys. And a lot of these fighters don't actually have pictures, because this is the very beginning wave of boxing. As a reference for what I'm going to rattle off here, John L. Sullivan was born in 1858, for reference here. So 1851 was the first fighter, the big tough guy Bill Farnan, which to his credit, he was one of the boxers that caused some trouble for a very young Peter Jackson. 1852 is Edward Starlight Rollins. 1858, boxer Lees. 1861 is an influx of four of the greatest fighters that we're going to run across, and the countdown of the pioneer list here. And all of these guys have a top 30 ranking. So 1861, Joe Goddard. 1861, Frank Patty Slavin. 1861, Peter Jackson. and 1861 Harry Laing. So now some of these are actually New Zealand, like Harry Laing is New Zealand, but a lot of them fought in Australia. In Sydney is where they would fight out of, and Laing was one of the few that actually fought in New Zealand, and then he invaded Australia because Australia, in the 1880s here, are the hotbed of boxing. It's bigger than any of the other countries. And 1863 would be Bob Fitzsimmons. 1866, Steve O'Donnell. 1867, Australian Billy Smith. 1866, the big black heavyweight, Peter Felix. 1868, Bill Doherty. 1868, Jim Hall. 1868, Bill Hefferman. In 1868, Dan Creedon. And finally, 1869, Owen Sullivan. Owen Sullivan is the one that Joe Choynski is going to mention in the days of the Finnish fighting as he talks about him and gives some background to him. And so these are the invasion of the Australians. And right now here, I'm going to go through quickly here. These are when a lot of the big-name fighters hit the American shores. The invasion of the Australians and their time frame here. 1888 was the first person to come over as Peter Jackson. The Black Prince invades the United States and starts setting up some very big matches. For reference, 1888 was when John L. Sullivan was kind of not quite out of his prime, but maybe. He had one exhibition and against a nobody in the beginning of 1888. His prior fight was with a third-rate contender, Patsy Carduff, and he wasn't of a championship quality. So how good John L. Sullivan was the following year in 1888 is questionable. But this is when Peter Jackson invades over, and they try and line up the big super fight, Peter Jackson and John L. Sullivan in 1888, and the fight never happens because John L. Sullivan draws the color line and basically is scared of Peter Jackson, so Jackson finds other opportunities. 1889 is when Frank Paddy Slavin invades England. So that is in 1889, and 1892 is going to be one of the biggest super fights of the 1890s, which is Frank Paddy Slavin versus Peter Jackson, as neither one of them are wasting time waiting around for John L. Sullivan. They are able to make money on their own. So 1889 is Australian Billy Smith comes over. 1890 is when the New Zealand Bob Fitzsimmons comes over, and he's immediately going to dethrone the American middleweight champion, Jack Dempsey. 1883, this is 3 years after Bob Fitzsimmons, who at that point in America made a pretty big name for himself. 1883 is when Dan Creedon comes over, and Creedon, unlike Bob Fitzsimmons, immediately started going right in and facing all the American black super fighters that had no fear whatsoever of them. 1891 is when Jim Hall comes over, which was the following year after Bob Fitzsimmons. 18 1892 is when Joe Goddard comes over, and he immediately comes over and knocks out, at that point, America's best heavyweight, which was Joe McAuliffe. 1894 is when the injury happens to Harry Laing. And 1893 is when Steve O'Donnell comes over, and he immediately is matched up with one of the great American fighters, Jake Kilrain, and immediately beats them. So most of these Australian fighters, when they are matched up against a lot of the great American fighters at the time, was able to beat them. They fought 6 championship fights. The Australians didn't fare super well in them, as a lot of them got knocked out pretty early, but still, I mean, part of the New Zealand class here is Bob Fitzsimmons, and he immediately won the championship from the American. So this is the giant wave of Australians that caused trouble throughout the boxing world of the 1890s, and a lot of these guys had some of the very biggest fights of the decade of the 1890s, but some of these guys were starting to get a little long in the tooth in the mid-1890s, like the barrier champion Joe Goddard, and their primes were very short in the pioneer era. Usually at the age of 25 would be when they were at the peak, and usually at the age of 30 they were at the end of the rope, the end of their prime at 30 years old, because the amount of punishment that the Finnish fights took on them, and fighting endless rounds, and their prime was very short. So basically, when they were 30 years old, they were not in their youth any longer, and that's when a lot of them started having problems. But these are the waves of the Australians, and they made an incredible impact on the beginning of the pioneer era of boxing. And now we are going to take some time, and I'm going to read you Joe Choynski's article about the days of the Finnish fight. Okay. This is Joe Choynski, and this is an article entitled "The Days of the Finnish Fights" by Joe Choynski. Big crowds watch me through my training stunts. My punching bag created excitement. The Australians had used only heavy bags. They were fascinated by the speed and skill that I showed with the light bag. And in a short amount of time, they were practicing on their own punching bags imported from the United States. The night of the fight came around, and I was stripping in my dressing room when I walked in. When in walked the jawbreaker. I proposed that we save a score, said Fogarty. I don't get you, says I. Then Fogarty explained that saving a score was the Australian way of proposing a loser's end of 20 pounds instead of fighting winner take all, as the Articles of Agreement stipulated. I agreed that the loser should have something. The fight with Fogarty went the scheduled 10 rounds. I jabbed him almost out and did not receive a scratch in return. The newspapers hailed this victory as a remarkable performance, and the Australians were so impressed with my work they sent for Joe Goddard, known as the barrier champion, to come from Melbourne to fight me. Now, this Goddard was one of the greatest natural fighters I ever saw. Unlike the other Australians, he was not clever, but he was fast and prodigiously strong, with a head like a lion. He almost He was almost a glutton for punishment, almost impervious to knockout punches. He was then rated as one of the great heavyweights of the world, on par with Peter Jackson, Frank Slavin, and even with John L. Sullivan. In fact, I believe that Goddard would have beaten Sullivan then, considering the condition of John L. This match with Goddard was quickly made, and I realized that it was the most ambitious undertaking so far, for Goddard outweighed me by 50 pounds. I finished my training in the hottest weather I ever experienced. The newspapers said the temperature went up at times to 120 degrees, and I believed it. It certainly gets hot in Australia in the summertime. The first round opened at a terrific pace. Before the fight had gone 1 minute, I knocked Goddard down with a blow that split his massive chin. The Australian rings were 24 feet each way, and the referee stands outside the ropes. When Goddard went down, the referee was on the opposite side, and he ran all the way around the ring before he began counting. The barrier champion was on the floor at least 6 seconds before the count began, and he took the full 10. Then Goddard begins a series of rushes, such as I have never experienced. Each time he rushes, I duck, and his hurling body would ram with such great force against my shoulder or elbow. The referee ordered me not to do this, asserting that it was a foul for my shoulder and elbow to collide with Goddard's body. This was a new rule for me, and there was nothing left for me to do but trade wallops with a far heavier man and one of the most dangerous hitters in the entire world. The fight became a slaughter. First, Goddard would knock me down, and then it would be my turn. Talk about thrills. The crowd was standing from the first exchange. The Sydney referee described the battle as the most terrible I have ever seen in Australia. In the fourth round, I was knocked out. In my scrapbook is a remarkable description of the combat, which I wish space permitted to reproduce in full, both for the details it gives a memorable battle and to show the vivid handling of boxing events by the Australians sports writers. I content myself with the referee's description of the third round of this battle with Goddard. Round 3. Like two whirlwinds, the men went at each other, and smash, smash, smash with sickening force fell the hailstorm of blows. "Keep away from Choynski," yelled one in the crowd, but he could not, or would not, for Foley had given the Australian his orders, and he was never to leave his man for a second. Fight for his body. Joe was Larry's mandate. He's slippery with the head, and as well for it. Joe Goddard, he was the king of seconds at his heels last night, for never in the world did a man meet wise counsel in time of desperation. Need more than did Joe Goddard last night. Smash on point went Choynski's left with a peculiar swing. Clap went his right, and down flop on his knees went Goddard. Then the frantic, furious, maddening struggle sped on, and the men locked together from sheer exhaustion. Swaying like two drunken men in a saloon, they fell in, their tracks all in a heap on the floor. As they struggled to get up, Goddard was bleeding from the nose and the mouth and a gash over his eye, and Choynski did not show a mark, but his body and neck and side of the head must have felt as if one of the posts of gates of hell had fallen upon them, as they were very red. Now for a moment it looked as if America had the battle won. Again and again did the plucky lad send home lefts and right on the iron frame of the giant, but he pegged away in vain. Flesh and blood would have quitted beneath the powerful blows Choynski had landed, but the barrier man is iron and road metal with a heart of steel. Once the ropes there were a fearful rally, and Choynski got back on them to support himself while trying for a knockout blow. Goddard did as he did the first night he fought Owen Sullivan. He drew back and hurled his gigantic frame upon the slim Tarkine lad and crushed him over the ropes, and Joe, poor game dashing lad, slipped down looking as if his ribs had been brushed out of him. A cry of foul was raised, but the fight went on. Though now both men were helpless, neither could lift a hand to deal a blow, and if the fate of a nation had been in the balance, then neither would have hurt a child. A few seconds they stood there, then fatality came of a vigorous frame and good training set them on their legs, and again they fought, to the astonishment of all. Choynski dashed in left 4 times hard and banged Joe Goddard so hard with his right that he dropped his hand and stood in the center of the ring, rocking on his heels with a sickly smile. Despite my defeat by Goddard, or perhaps because of it, the Australians regarded me with great favor and offered me a match with Owen Sullivan, another leading heavyweight, 6 feet 5 inches tall. Sullivan had fought 2 terrific battles with Goddard. The match was made, and an admirer of mine, whose name I cannot now recall, stated the Sydney Sport by offering a wager of £300 that I would stop Sullivan in 4 rounds. The wager was promptly accepted, of course. That is the end of part 1. Okay, this is part 2, where Joe Choynski is going to describe his match that was following the Goddard match with Owen Sullivan. Owen Sullivan was not only of gigantic proportions, but he was one of the cleverest boxers of the Larry Foley school. My friend had wagered I would stop Sullivan in 4 rounds and was considered balmy, and I confess I believe he had acted rashly. But I knocked Sullivan out in the first round with a punch to the ribs. He had to be carried from the ring, and we were afraid he was going to die. It was a week before he could leave the bed, and my friend had won the bet. Still believing I could beat Joe Goddard, I asked for a return match, and the barrier champion consented. The second meeting was held at Melbourne and was almost a repetition of the first. Goddard again beat me in 4 rounds of desperate fighting. Again, I came against the referee's ruling prohibiting me from striking Goddard with my shoulders and elbows when the bodies collided with me as I ducked. While it does not belong at this point to tell about it, I think it's fair to record that had I met Goddard a 3rd time 2 years later in Philadelphia with an American referee and gave him a bad beating in 6 rounds, in that contest Goddard did not lay a glove on me. Despite my 2 defeats of Goddard, the Australians rated me as a great fighter. In that country, a defeated man is not thrown in the discards. I, like several other characteristics of Australians. For example, after I knocked out Owen Sullivan, I went but to the racetrack the next day and was nearly floored when strangers would introduce themselves to me and tell me they won on me and offered to divide their winnings with me. Who ever heard of such a thing in America? Another delightful custom was the way they paid over the stakes. A banquet was held the day after the fight, to which the principal and their seconds and their managers and members of the press were all invited. Complimentary things were said, and the fighters were given their money in a most glorious fashion. One day in Melbourne, I was sitting in a particular oyster house conducted by Jack Wager, a well-to-do Australian sporting character. Suddenly, I heard a fearful uproar accompanied by a crash of broken glass. I looked around and saw a man riding through the front door on a horse. I was amazed to recognize the rider as Duncan Harrison, manager of John L. Sullivan, who was then touring Australia with his melodrama Honest Hearts and Winning Hands. Harrison was arrested for his drunkenness and fined the customary Australian 7 and 6, meaning 7 shillings 6 pence, equivalent in American money is to about $1.85. The Sullivan show was a flop in Australia. The Australians are lovers of art and patron of the drama, but the spectacles of Sullivan playing the role of a poor blacksmith whose family was threatened with eviction from a home, Sullivan dressed in silk short, black velvet pants, silky hose, and wearing a big diamonds was too much for the critical judgment of playing a poor blacksmith, and they laughed at him during the shows. I was next matched with Mick Dooley, cleverest of all the Larry Foyle pupils. Dooley had also fought Goddard 2 hard fights, losing the last one in 18 rounds. Dooley had also fought hard battles with Frank Slavin that generally regarded as the equivalent of Joe Goddard. Dooley only weighed 168 pounds, and that was my first man I faced at my own weight that I met. But Dooley's wonderful skill was not much greater than my own by that time, for I had profited by the study of boxing Australians, adapting much of it to my American knowledge. I knocked Dooley cold in the first round. My last appearance in Australia was in an exhibition bout with Steve O'Donnell, another remarkably clever boxer, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and afterward became Gentleman Jim Corbett's sparring partner. Steve had every natural advantage except courage. The next day I ran into John L. Sullivan in the street, and he invited me into an alehouse to have a drink. He told me he was tired of the poor patronage his show had attracted and suggested that as I was about to return home, we book a passage on the same ship. I readily agreed, and I traveled with John L. Sullivan back to America. Just before I departed for home, after 14 months in Australia, a banquet was given to me at Melbourne, and I was presented by the Sports of Melbourne with a pure silk purse containing 200 souvenirs. The Sydney referee, of course, Bill Corbett, no relation to Jim Corbett, was editor, and he gave me a fine eulogy in the issue of the week. This was written by Smiler Hale, able boxing authority in Australia, perhaps in the entire world. The articles contain more compliments for me than I care to quote. A great crowd was at the pier to bid farewell to John L. Sullivan and myself as we sailed for America, where I had in store for me more important fighting than I ever dreamed of at the time. I was to fight such great men in the ring as Jeffries, Fitzsimmons, Sharkey 3 times, Kid McCoy 3 times, Peter Mahor 3 times, Jack Johnson, Jim Hall twice, Denver Ed Smith, George Godfrey, Gus Rulin, Joe McAuffle, Dan Creedon, and Joe Walcott, to name only the more prominent, and a whole army of lesser-known fighters. Each of these fights was a real battle of drama and action. I believe the story as told by one of the participants would be decidedly interesting to the lovers of the sport. Many interesting details of these battles, such as things a referee in the ring, have never been told. In subsequent articles, I endeavor to recall these events by a bygone generation. And that is the end of Joe Choynski's recap of the Australians and his final trip back home with John L. Sullivan, as both of them leave Australia. And at least Joe Choynski fought some of the Australians as John L. Sullivan was getting booed off the stage and had no interest in fighting any of the Australians at the time.